David Calloway's tough question suddenly filled the night with tension. The journalist thought he had Melania cornered, but things didn't go as he had planned. Just then, Barron Trump took the stage. The 17-year-old young man's unexpected intervention stunned the entire room. The famous Crystal Hall in New York City was illuminated that evening with a sense of social responsibility. The evening was designed to bring together some of society's brightest faces, allowing them to unite for a greater good. As the city's elite, leaders of charitable organizations, and prominent media figures sipped sparkling champagne, they discussed current world events and their responsibilities in addressing them. The elegance of the evening blended with the refined attire of the guests, the soft music, the laughter, and the sound of clinking glasses. Melania Trump took the stage in a stunning navy blue dress. Despite her husband's ever-changing political agenda and harsh criticism of her, she remained as elegant as ever. Everyone in the hall noticed her impressive poise, but what truly stood out was Melania's sincere commitment to a charitable cause. Drawing her identity and strength from these acts of kindness elevated her above all the chaos. When she stepped onto the stage, the conversation in the room suddenly stopped. Everyone turned their eyes to her. Melania began to speak calmly but firmly. There was a strong emotion behind her words, each sentence expressing her deep connection to the topic and her sense of social responsibility. Her Slovenian accent lent an elegant tone to her words, and every expression reflected her sincerity. But just as she was about to finish, the silence in the hall was suddenly broken. "Mrs. Trump, how does it feel to be a wife who stands behind your husband's policies?" The voice echoed like a scream, cutting through the air in the room. The question was provocative and a direct attack. The man holding the microphone was a well-known journalist, carefully dressed and confidently poised. He was David Calloway, a media representative known for his liberal views and especially for his harsh criticism of right-wing politicians. He didn't just ask questions, he took aim and didn't wait for answers. The guests in the hall began to fidget in their seats, uneasiness in their eyes. Some exchanged meaningful glances, while others sensed that the atmosphere was about to become increasingly tense. Melania parted her lips slightly and was about to respond, but Calloway took a step further and continued. "With our country so polarized right now, how do you stand in the face of your husband's rhetoric, especially when it incites hatred?" he asked. His tone was now even harsher, almost as if he was trying to push Melania into a corner. "And here you are, silent on all this, just standing behind your husband. Isn't true leadership found in those who stand up to him?" These words sent a wave of tension through the room. The guests stood in deep silence, trying to figure out what was going to happen next. A few members of the media, sensing that a significant moment was developing, turned to their cameras. Melania was about to respond calmly, but it soon became clear that the moment would be interrupted by another voice. "Enough!" All eyes turned to the owner of the voice. It was Barron Trump. The young man who had once stood silently in the shadow of the White House was now stepping onto the stage. At 17, he walked tall and confident, commanding the attention of everyone around him. No longer just the president's son, but an individual who had found his own identity and was determined to stand up to the unjust targeting of his mother. With quick and decisive steps, Barron made his way to the stage. As the guests looked at each other in surprise, he took a strong stance and stood between Melania and Calloway. In an instant, the atmosphere in the hall changed. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm, but with a suppressed power. Calloway raised his eyebrows and looked at Barron in surprise for a moment, but Barron continued without taking his eyes off him. "You can certainly ask difficult questions," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But what you are doing is not journalism. It is a form of bullying." The guests in the room began to whisper, recognizing the unexpected outburst and the tense atmosphere. Some appreciated Barron's courageous stance, while others sensed that the situation was about to escalate. Calloway smiled slightly, but in a way, it was an attempt to diffuse the situation. "Oh, so Trump's son is going to lecture me on journalistic ethics?" Calloway said, with a touch of sarcasm. Barron tilted his head slightly and did not take his eyes off Calloway's. There was determination and defiance in his gaze. "No," Barron said, his tone firm and clear. "I will show you true respect." As the Baron's words echoed through the ballroom, the tension suddenly peaked. Unnoticed until that moment, the growing tension spread like a giant wave throughout the room. All eyes were on Barron. No one had expected the young man to make such a confident outburst. Calloway paused for a moment. He had expected Barron to panic and get angry, or at least respond angrily. But the young man standing before him was neither angry nor panicked. He just stood still and remained calm. Calloway's wry smile disappeared momentarily, but he quickly recovered and gave a contemptuous laugh. "You speak of respect, do you?" he said, sarcasm in his voice. "Forgive me, Barron, but I don't think you and your family are in a position to lecture the press on respect." A few guests smiled nervously, while the others watched this moment in silence, like a chess match. But the Baron never moved. His posture was erect, his gaze sharp and patient. When he spoke, his voice echoed throughout the room. "You can ask me any question," he said, "but your attitude just now was less of a question and more of a belittlement of my mother," Barron replied, determination and confidence clear in his voice. Calloway's mocking expression faded, but it remained. "Ms. Trump is a public figure," he defended himself. "She should be prepared for tough questions." The Baron took another step, this time causing Calloway to look slightly up at him. Still calm, still taking his time, he said, "Well, then why didn't you talk during the night about the work my mother did for the children, her contributions to society?" The crowd reacted with surprise to this simple but profound question. It was clear that Calloway could not really answer this question. His intention was to belittle Melania Trump's achievements, but the Baron's cool demeanor seemed to turn the tables. The Baron didn't stop so that the man in front of him wouldn't be any more uncomfortable. "You came here to get headlines," he said. "You wanted to make viral videos and get thousands of likes on Twitter, but you weren't interested in anything to do with the event." The room was suddenly silent. A few guests in the back realized that the Baron was not only reacting, but almost controlling the moment. Calloway's confidence was slowly eroding. He looked out of the corner of his eye at other journalists for help, but none of them would support him. This was not a situation Calloway was used to. He was stunned to receive such a reaction, especially from a 17-year-old boy. Melania stood silently behind her son, gently touching his arm, supporting him. With just a look, she was sending the message, "I'm with you. I support you." Calloway quickly tried to turn the tables. Forcing a smile, he folded his arms and nodded. "You're young, Baron," he said. "You don't yet understand how these things work." The Baron replied calmly, never taking his eyes off her. "I know exactly how it works," he said. "As a child, I witnessed attacks on my family." Calloway's expression changed. The Baron took another step forward, and the determination in his voice became clearer. "I just didn't think you would make such an outrageous attack on a woman who was trying to help others," he said. The crowd responded with murmurs, moved by the Baron's words. A few nodded their heads in agreement, while many journalists remained stunned. Calloway's face flushed slightly, but he did not respond immediately. Just then, another voice broke the silence. "The Baron is right." An old man stood in the corner of one of the tables. His hair was the color of salt and pepper, and his posture reflected the casualness of someone who had been attending events for years. He was a respected businessman. Perhaps he had made a large donation to the event. Looking directly at Calloway, he said, "This is a charity event," he said. "It's not the place to play political games." Several people in the crowd nodded in agreement. Calloway realized that he was losing his customary confidence. He was losing the moment, and Barron Trump was still standing, cornering him more and more with every passing second. In the ballroom, the tension and anticipation grew. All eyes were on the Baron. No one had expected such a posture. There was no anger, no deviation, only composure and determination. His every word had more and more impact. Without missing a beat, the Baron was destroying Calloway. David Calloway, that self-confident liberal journalist, realized that he was losing control internally. He gritted his teeth. He had never expected to find such a cool and decisive stance in his attacks on Melania Trump. Calloway gave a forced laugh, shook his head and said, "You know, Barron, growing up in a golden tower, it's easy to stand behind your family. But here, in the real world, people have to ask hard questions like me. That's journalism." A few ordinary guests instinctively nodded their heads in agreement, but something had gone wrong. The usual rhythm of the media was not working that night. Calloway's words had become defensive and desperate. The Baron tilted his head slightly to the side, and a slight wry smirk appeared on his lips. He had seized the moment. "Are you talking about the real world?" he asked. "The world where my mother is here doing things that change people's lives?" "What you said about my mother." Calloway's grinning expression immediately disappeared as Barron's voice trailed off. Taking a step closer, Barron continued calmly. "You're talking about the real world, are you?" he said, gesturing to the guests in the hall. "So, how many people here really came here to do something useful for society, to contribute to the future of children, to do something for education?" Some guests nodded their heads in agreement. Others raised their hands in the air in support of Barron's remarks. Even those who weren't close to Trump made it clear that they were using the evening as an opportunity to contribute to a charitable cause. "And how many people are here just to talk about their own interests?" Barron asked, turning his head and looking coldly at Calloway. An uneasiness spread through the room. Calloway hesitated for a moment, but Barron cut him off and continued. "Really, you are the only one here tonight who thinks everything is based on politics." A group of guests applauded lightly. It was not just an acknowledgement, but an endorsement of the truth of what Barron had said. "You came here to belittle my mother, but in the end, you disgraced yourself," Barron said, folding his arms and fixing his eyes on Calloway. At that moment, the crowd exploded. Calloway's face flushed, but he dared not say anything more. His confidence, his arrogance, everything was gone in an instant. Barron struck the final blow. "Next time," he said, "if you want to attack a Trump, maybe you should try not to mess with someone out of your depth." The applause in Crystal Hall echoed around the room. Calloway was completely disheartened, unable to think of anything to say in response. He had lost tonight, and Barron's stance had sent a clear message to the crowd. Everyone had noticed. Barron had left his mark. Calloway's once confident, grinning face was gone, replaced by a tight, cold expression. He felt as if the ground was slipping out from under him. Barron stood tall, his shoulders broad, his gaze on Calloway like a lion. He had seized the moment, and the crowd realized it. Calloway was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. The journalist still hadn't surrendered, but he was trying to turn the tables. Straightening his tie, he smiled a little wryly. "Is that it?" he said, the sharpness gone from his voice. "Don't I have the right to question? Isn't it more important to you that your mother is not upset?" Barron's expression remained unchanged as he replied calmly, "You did not interrogate. You only made accusations." There were a few approving murmurs from the crowd. Even Trump's opponents acknowledged that Barron was right. Calloway squeezed his eyes shut and looked at the other journalists, but none of them agreed with him. They were aware of the situation. Calloway had lost control. Barron took another step forward, forcing Calloway to step back, not in a violent manner, but simply with his posture. "You tried to falsely accuse my mother," he said, "but you failed because she is here to help. She touches children's lives. She makes a difference." Barron pointed to the charity posters in the hall, showing photos of children and families supported by the Melania Foundation. "What about you?" Barron continued, bowing his head slightly. "What did you really contribute tonight? What did you do? You just tried to paint a dark picture." Calloway's face grew redder, losing confidence by the second. His shoulders tensed, His grip on the microphone tightened, and for a moment he looked uncomfortable for the first time. The crowd was no longer on his side. Some shook their heads, realizing that Calloway had lost tonight. "I was just doing my job," Calloway whispered, taking a deep breath. Barron grinned slightly and spoke one last time. "Then," he said, "maybe you should try to do it better." The crowd erupted once more. The applause was more than just a polite acknowledgement. It became a roar that echoed around the room. Even the anti-Trump crowd couldn't ignore it. Calloway had taken center stage to turn the night into a spectacle. However, it was not Calloway himself who transformed the night, but Barron Trump. Barron defeated him in front of the elite media. Melania smiled faintly as she watched in silence. There was no need to say anything. Her son had already done what needed to be done. When Calloway realized that there was no escape from this disaster, he dropped the microphone and turned away. At that moment, as he began to leave the room in shame, Barron Trump not only returned to his mother's side, but also showed everyone the future power and influence of the Trump family. David Calloway gripped the microphone so tightly that his fingertips turned white. He realized that he had completely lost, but the worst part was that his loss was not because he had been shouted down, because no one had shouted him down. A 17-year-old had beaten him in front of the whole room. The crowd was still moving. Some were clapping, others whispering. Calloway's onlookers glanced at him out of the corner of their eyes, as if watching someone watch their own demise. Some journalists chose not to look at him, embarrassed as colleagues to see what was happening. But Calloway was not about to give up yet. He felt his career flashing before his eyes. This was a job he could easily win, a headline-grabbing ambush that could go viral in minutes. But now he looked like a fool and was being embarrassed by the people he was trying to impress. He had to get his act together. "Well," he said, lifting the microphone again with a weak smile, "if you find it hard to fight back, maybe politics is not the field for you." It was a desperate move, but Barron responded without even blinking. That's it. At that moment, it became clear that Calloway had completely lost. He had given it his all, but Barron stood there, calm and unaffected. The applause behind him was no longer just for Barron, but to celebrate Calloway's failure. Some whispers began to rise from the crowd. One man, a wealthy donor sitting in the front row, turned to his wife and smiled, whispering something to her. Calloway saw it all and realized in that moment that not only would he lose this conversation, but he would leave as a failure. His face tensed as he left the room, whispering something almost inaudible through his lips. Cameras followed his every step. He had entered this hall to make a big impression, but he had become a headline, and the world was going to watch. Meanwhile, Barron turned towards his mother. Melania gave him a brief glance, her expression momentarily neutralized. Then, with the grace that had defined her for years, she straightened his jacket with just a light touch. It was a small but meaningful gesture. Barron smiled slightly, thanked her with a nod, and then turned back to the crowd. The crowd, sensing this special moment, stood up and gave him a standing ovation. Melania felt proud to be next to Barron and, at the same time, realized that something was beginning to change. For years, people had looked down on her, seeing her only as the youngest member of the Trump family. But tonight, no one would make the same mistake. Barron Trump glanced after Calloway amidst the applause. After a brief glimpse of the silhouette of the man leaving the room, his voice echoed clear and decisive. "Truth is powerful enough to silence even the loudest voices." There was a deep silence in the hall. Then the applause erupted, this time louder and more enthusiastic. Barron bowed his head with dignity, smiled, and turned to his mother. There was pride and peace in Melania's gaze. Tonight was not just a debate, but the end of one era and the beginning of another.